Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Over the course of her career, Jane Smiley has written a tragedy, a comedy, an epic, an academic satire, books about books, a biography of Charles Dickens, a young adult series, a trilogy taking place over 100 years, where each chapter covered 1 year, and most recently a bestseller about a racehorse who escaped from the track in Paris. Well, the new book is wonderful. It is called A Dangerous Business, and she gives us a murder mystery set in Gold Rush, California. It is a novel that combines Jane's love of the Monterey Peninsula, where she has lived for 25 years, her keen sense of and interest in history, and her love of such writers as Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and Sue Grafton. The novel tells the remarkable story of the California gold rush and a pair of sex worker sleuths who track down the culprit behind a series of disappearances. Jane Smiley is the author of numerous novels, including 1,000 Acres, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. It is a pleasure to welcome Jane Smiley back to the Book Show. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's not pouring rain, and there are no floods at the moment. So
Excellent. Well, we're glad to hear it. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. What
thank
brought
you.
you to this particular subject of? I'll ask you about the characters in a moment, but of
hmm
just the idea of a mystery.
Well, I'd written a mystery before. It was called Duplicate Keys, and it was set in New York. And I've always liked mysteries. I've enjoyed reading them. And the great thing about Monterey is that you can walk around town and really get a sense of what it felt like to be in that town when it was, just starting out. Monterey was the capital of California for about a year, and people were drawn to it. But when they got here, they realized that some of the things that they wanted to do here, such as finding gold or using the bay as a harbor, were not going to happen. The winds are too unreliable in the bay because of the orientation, the geographical orientation, and the gold was somewhere else. And so a lot of people moved on, but a lot of people stayed, and it ended up being quite a mixed and interesting community. But for me, one of the main things was that all the buildings are very well preserved and there's plenty of museums. So you can really get a sense of what it felt like to be in Monterey. And I had wanted to write another mystery, so I thought, well, why not? Let's start here
Mm.
in 1850 or 1852, I guess it is, or 51, and just see what it was like.
And what's fascinating about it is that it allows the time allows the place to welcome people because of where it is, of people who are coming and going into this port.
Yeah. I mean, some of the people that Eliza, who's the main character, some of the people that she meets have been at sea for months. One of the men she meets came around South America to get here. So it was very fascinating in the way that things were in the mid 19th century. You kind of did the best you could and hoped for the best and tried not to be knocked over. She and her husband come from Michigan through the Rockies. And then when they end up here, they're quite relieved to be
Right.
in such a pleasant spot.
So and then at that point, Eliza is on her own.
Yeah.
And I guess now's as good a time as any to ask you of what you found interesting of making the main sleuth and the pair, the two women,
hmm
sex workers at that time, while in the shadow of the gold rush.
Well, in the first place, Eliza's husband is abusive. And when he arrives, he gets shot in a bar fight. So she doesn't really know what she wants other than not to go back to her family in Michigan. At that point, she's only about 20. And she was married off to him under some various false pretenses on his part. And so a woman gives her a card or what's essentially a card, and says, "If you need anything, come to me." And Eliza thinks, well, she needs some money, and she goes there and realizes that she's at a brothel. But the people that she meets in Monterey, and there is historical justification for this, are generally kind. And Mrs. Parks, who's been in the business for a while, knows that she has to take care of her employees and help them in order to maintain her business.
Right.
And so she is maybe the first kindly person that Eliza has met. So she goes for it. And then when she's in the business, she discovers that a lot of her clients or customers, or whoever you want to call them, are nicer to her than her husband was. So she's drawn into it because it seems like a decent and safe thing to be doing. Now, there's a lot of evidence that in Monterey at the time, there were fewer women than there were men, maybe 6 or 7 women versus 10 men in the population. That would be the ratio. And so the men were pretty good to the women because they were few and far between. So it was a good place in some ways to be a woman in the early 1850s.
Mrs. Parks, you use this as a quote at the beginning of the novel, but you also use it within the context of the novel. "Between you and me, being a woman is a dangerous business, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." So there is protection, but yes, it's a dangerous business.
Yes, but everything is. Even the landscape, which is very beautiful, is a dangerous one. There are storms, and people who have cattle or horses, sometimes they fall down into the ravines, and people themselves fall into the ravines. There can be shipwrecks. It's the mid-19th century, and it's a pretty wild landscape. And so everybody is beset with some kinds of worries, but you just have to do the best you can. And that's what Eliza wants to do. She feels that she is free to do the best she can in a way that she was not back in Michigan.
I was fascinated by the fact that the women in this, even who work for Mrs. Parks, don't live with one another. They live separately off the campus, if you will, of the house, and they come and go, but they're really not overly friendly with one another. They just come in, they do their work, and they leave. It's not a communal setting.
No, Mrs. Parks wants the brothel to thrive, but she doesn't want it to become a topic of gossip or disdain, among the other citizens. So she wants to keep it on the quiet and take care of the girls, and she wants them to be responsible and also not objects of gossip or speculation.
And that works for Eliza, although she is looking for friendship and does find it.
Yes. When I came up with the idea of Jean, who's Eliza's friend, Jean also works in a brothel, but she tells Eliza that they are their customers are women. And when I sent my book to the local historian, and had him go through it, and he was wonderful at going through it, word by word in very detailed manner. He said he didn't know. He knew there were regular brothels in Monterey, and he didn't know about this one, but he said it certainly was plausible. And so I took that as permission to have Jean. Jean is an interesting character. She she's brave, and she likes to cross dress and pretend to be other types of people than she is. And she also has a great sense of humor. And I think Eliza finds herself feeling safe around Jean when she doesn't necessarily feel safe on her own. And so Jean was a fun character to add.
Jane Smiley is our guest in this week's book show. The new novel, A Dangerous Business. It is published by Knopf. It is their reading of Edgar Allan Poe that is sort of helps them in the early stages of looking and of how to look at a crime and to think about it. And I'm interested in that aspect as well as your own connection to Edgar Allan Poe.
Well, it's Jean who has read Poe. Jean has read him and enjoyed him because she likes scary stories. Eliza has not been allowed to read those sorts of things, and she doesn't like scary stories anyway. But it's Jean who realizes when she reads Murders in the Rue Morgue that you have to think about what's going on in a certain way. You have to come up with some sort of logical way of imagining what has happened. And you have to be observant. And so that's what helps them. I mean, this book takes place before the rise of the murder mystery, even though Wilkie Collins, who essentially invented the murder mystery, was hard at work at this point. But since they live in California, they would not have read any of his books at this point. So I had to come up with some kind of inspiration. And it's pretty clear that Wilkie Collins was also inspired by Poe. So he's the one.
It seems that these women as sex workers are basically, if not fully respected by the community, certainly not disrespected by the community.
Well, yes, I would say that was true. And the historian felt that was true too. Because what else is the community going to do? Some of the men who come to Jean have been on board ships for months, and others have lost their families, or some of them are very young, and the community is not full of a bunch of jerks. And Mrs. Parks is very careful to be sure that her employees are not hurt or even in danger. She hires someone to watch out for the brothel, and she gives rules about, okay, if someone starts doing blah blah blah, this is how you inform Carlos. He's the guy who watches out for them. And Eliza has to do that sometimes. But I think that what she discovers in her world of the brothel is that the men that she meets are not like her husband. It's sort of an upside down thing where your husband is supposed to be the best guy that you've come to know, but in her case, he's the worst, or one of the worst.
Eliza is a fascinating character because there's this lack of worldliness, for one of, I guess it would be the term, worldliness, and yet confident when it comes to her business.
Well, her lack of worldliness comes from having been raised in an extremely religious Protestant family, where she had her whole life she's an only child, and her whole life has been circumscribed by the rules that her mother has made, and that her mother has learned from the church that they belong to. And so in some sense, she has not had the opportunity to explore anything before she gets here. And then when she gets here, her husband confines her at the beginning. And so, in some sense, his death is the opening of the door for her. And by that time, she's 20, almost 21, and she's very innocent. So she goes out into the world, and it's beautiful, and she doesn't really know what to expect, but she's too innocent really to understand what might be out there. She
Mm.
just wants to be free. And fortunately, she meets Jean very early, and Jean is very wary of what might be out there, and also self-confident. So they connect in that way, because Jean is in some sense Eliza's protector. But Eliza is also very observant, so they both offer something the attempting the solution of the question of who is killing some of the other prostitutes around town.
It's interesting because Eliza, seems to be happy with the work, and enjoys not only what she does, but when she is out, when she is in town, and with at that place of Monterey, which is what you
Mm-hmm.
do so beautifully, is to make that place very alive of her living in that town and being a part of it.
Well, yes. I mean, who wouldn't enjoy living in Monterey? Except, when when the rain is pouring down, and
Right.
um, when you have to slip slide down the muddy hills. But there's so many beautiful spots, and it's so interesting that a very elegant house, let's say, can be right around the corner from a deep ravine and a thick woodland, or on the other hand, the ocean, and a prominence that you could crawl up to and look at the ocean. And they liked, especially Jean, but Eliza too. They like going out and looking at the bay and watching the fish and seeing whether the whales are going to breach or something like that. So it's not a place like either of them have ever been before. And every time they look around, something interesting is happening. And so, who would want to leave here? That's what they think. And I think it's curiosity for both of them that pulls them out of their, let's say, what we might call their safe spots, and into looking and seeing what's going on.
Mm.
But also, they're kindly. They care about these girls. They care about what happened to them, and they think they want to know what might happen to others. There's sometimes when Eliza is afraid, but then curiosity makes her fear sort of dissipate as she looks around.
And she is very curious. That curiosity grows.
Yes.
Jane Smiley is our guest. The name of the new book is A Dangerous Business. It is published by Knopf. I'm interested in the language. You seem to, for a book about sex work, this is not explicit, and you seem to have come up with a uniform language for the sex act itself as well as genitalia. And I found that really interesting because obviously it's something that you could have you could have played around with it in the sense of using a lot of different descriptors, but you settle in and use it, and as I said, it becomes almost uniform, which is really interesting.
Well, I didn't want it to be erotic fiction. My job wasn't to turn the reader on. My job was to analyze what was going on, and to see things from Eliza and Jean's point of view. And what Eliza likes in some of her clients or customers is that she actually connects with a few of them. You know, she's kind of astounded
Mm.
one of them automatically kind of takes her out to lunch one morning, or a brunch, you might call it, a late breakfast. She's not surprised when some of them aren't very nice, but she is surprised when some of them do want to connect with her and do want to tell her about themselves. And so for her, this is an education in connection rather than an education in sexuality. The sexual parts are practical, and she understands that, and Mrs.
Right.
Parks understands that. But I didn't want it to be, let's say like 10 Days in the Hills, a kind of picture of eroticism. I wanted to be a picture of business.
And that's interesting too, because you mentioned Mrs. Parks again, but Mrs. Parks is very much looking after these women, but it is a business.
Yes, absolutely.
To her, yes.
Yes.
What fascinated you that would bring her to that place?
Well, Mrs. Parks remains a little bit mysterious, and I decided that was a good thing. There's a point at the end where Eliza, and Mrs. Parks doesn't like to be investigated. She offers information sometimes, like she does mention the women's rights conference in upstate New York in the 1850s, and I can't remember the name of the town. And she does mention that she had started out as a sex worker, but she doesn't say anything about her own life. And at one point, Eliza kind of says, well, what's your real name? Is your real name Mrs. Parks? And she says, well, is your real name Eliza Ripple? And that's all she says. But that's okay. She can keep herself to herself.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, it does seem that if you, and I don't know if that was the original plan or not, but did you ever think about writing about these characters again? There seems to be many openings for you to continue a story here.
Well, it's definitely tempting to follow them and see what they do. They go their different ways at the end of the book, and I'm not going to say what those ways are. But this is a very eventful period in American history. And so each of these characters is going to be affected by what else is going on as the 1850s progress. And, by 1855, Eliza would still only be 25. So it'd be quite interesting to see what she was going to do next. But I haven't come up with an idea or a plot. It's just a temptation so far.
Mm. Are you often tempted of directions? I mean, I read in the introduction the different avenues that you have explored. So it seems that you like to scratch those itches occasionally.
I do. And I actually I know a guy who's a historian, David Blight, who specializes in American history. And he did tell me that the 1850s were the most pivotal decade in American history. But my editor says I cannot be obsessed by the 1850s. So I have to intersperse whatever I want to write about the 1850s with other books too. I mean, one of my favorite of my books is The All True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton, which takes place in the 1850s in Kansas. And I actually have written a sequel, but we'll see if it ever comes out or not.
Well, who makes that
so maybe
decision?
she can meet up. Maybe she can meet up with Eliza. That would be fun.
That seems like it's up to you, right? And that's not something you want yet.
No, it's not up to me. It's up to my publisher. It's not that they have turned it down or anything. It's just that the question is, well, does anybody care about a sequel to a book that's basically 25 years old?
Right.
Or does anybody care other than me? Well, I thought I had a really wonderful, lots of fun writing it. So here's hoping.
You talk about obsessions, but you've been writing a lot about horses lately, of course, and both adult novels and YA novels. And there are wonderful moments about, I would say, equine strains in this novel as well.
Can't get away from it. Sorry.
Don't be sorry. It's absolutely beautiful. But it's something you're comfortable and I assume have fun writing about.
Oh, very much. Horses are very distinctive and interesting and, of course, beautiful and lots of fun to be on top of. So you just have to keep following them and going, wow, I can't believe he knows that or she knows that. I think they're way more intelligent than they've been given credit for. And that's one thing that fascinates me.
This book is so tight. It is a slim volume, but it is just so beautifully crafted. And I'm interested because not all of your books are obviously this short. What is it like to write in that style? Which I guess, of course, goes with the genre of a mystery.
I think so. The mystery can't go on too long, or the reader will lose track of the logic behind what's going on. If you look at the mysteries that have hung around, they're pretty short. The Hound of the Baskervilles or some Agatha Christie mysteries. And it's because the plot is the focus. The plot has to be simple enough to understand, but complex enough to be mysterious. And really, it would be really hard to push that up to, say, 300 pages. And so most mysteries are short. And this one was short too.
And yet seems perfect, and also you always want them leaving them wanting more, I assume.
Of course.
Absolutely. The new novel is A Dangerous Business by Jane Smiley. It is published by Knopf. Jane, it is always a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, it's fun to be on it. It's fun to be on it for me too.
Thank you very much. Again, Jane Smiley's new novel is Dangerous Business. It is published by Knopf. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week.